Liam caught the backpack with a smirk, shaking it as if expecting to hear coins rattling inside. Probably just a bunch of boring books, he chuckled, tossing it over to Ethan. The cafeteria murmured as students glanced over, some laughing, others shifting uncomfortably. Trey clenched his fists, but remained seated, his father's words echoing in his mind. Stay calm, stay focused, never give them the reaction they want. Ethan unzipped the bag, rummaging through its contents with an exaggerated look of disgust. Ugh, what is this? A math textbook? A notebook full of nerd notes? He flipped open a page, squinting at the neat handwriting. But then, his expression changed. His brow furrowed as he scanned the page. Ryan, noticing the shift, grabbed the notebook from him. What's the matter? Find his diary? Ryan laughed, flipping through the pages, until he too fell silent. His smirk faded as his eyes darted across the words, realization dawning. Trey sat still, watching, waiting. Ryan cleared his throat. Wait, these aren't school notes. Liam snatched the notebook and skimmed through it. No way, he muttered under his breath. The entire cafeteria watched as the bullies, who had been so eager to humiliate Trey, suddenly stood frozen, as if they had just uncovered something they weren't meant to see. And then, without another word, Ryan carefully closed the notebook, placed it back in the backpack, and set it gently on the table in front of Trey. For the first time ever, the bullies had nothing to say. Trey's heart pounded as he watched Ethan grip the small metal box. His fingers instinctively twitched, itching to snatch it back, but he knew better than to react. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, his father's words echoing in his mind. Never give them what they want. Ryan leaned in, intrigued by Trey's sudden shift in demeanor. Oh, now you care? He taunted, waving the box in front of him. What's so special about this, huh? Maybe it's his secret stash of money, or... He paused dramatically, grinning at his crew. His love letters to some girl who'd never even look at him. Liam and Ethan burst into laughter, feeding off Ryan's cruelty. Ethan tapped the small lock. Too bad we don't have a key. Ryan, still smirking, shook his head. Don't need one, just break it open. Trey felt his pulse hammer against his skin. Don't, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The bullies exchanged glances, surprised that he had finally spoken. Ryan raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. Oh? Why not? He turned the box over in his hands, testing its weight. What's in here, Trey? Something embarrassing? A big secret? The cafeteria had grown quieter, more students now watching the scene unfold. A few whispered amongst themselves, wondering what was inside the mysterious box that had suddenly made Trey, who had never fought back before, look ready to explode. Trey swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Just give it back, he said evenly, meeting Ryan's gaze for the first time. Ryan chuckled. See, now I really want to know what's inside. He lifted the box over his head, pretending to examine it under the cafeteria lights. What do you guys think? Should we open it? Liam shrugged, playing along. I say do it. What's he gonna do? Trey exhaled sharply, already calculating his next move. He could fight for it, but that would only make things worse. He could call for help, but he doubted anyone would step in. His only option was to wait, because if they opened that box, they would be the ones speechless. Ryan, fueled by arrogance, ignored Trey's warning. With one swift motion, he pried at the small lock, forcing it open. The box clicked. The lid creaked. And as Ryan peered inside, the confident grin on his face evaporated in an instant. His hands shook. Liam and Ethan, curious, leaned in to see what had shut their leader up so fast. And then the entire cafeteria gasped. Ryan's fingers trembled as he held the photograph, his confidence suddenly stripped away. The entire cafeteria, which had once been filled with laughter and taunts, was now eerily silent. Every student who had been watching the bullying unfold was now staring, eyes wide with curiosity and confusion. Liam picked up one of the documents, his face scrunching in concentration. "These are government files," he muttered. His eyes darted over the official stamps, the classified seals, and Trey's father's name, bold and undeniable. "What is this? Some kind of military thing?" Ethan, usually the loudest of the group, suddenly had nothing to say. His gaze flicked from the documents to Trey, then back to Ryan, waiting for someone to make sense of what they were seeing. Trey could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years keeping this part of his life hidden, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew people wouldn't understand. His father, Colonel Marcus Mitchell, had been a highly decorated intelligence officer, someone who had worked on classified operations that the public wasn't even supposed to know about. His involvement had been so secretive that even after his passing, the details remained buried, until now. Ryan's bravado had completely vanished. His mouth opened and closed, as if he wanted to make another cruel remark, but couldn't find the words. He flipped the photograph over, his fingers brushing against handwritten words on the back. "To my son, Trey, never forget where you come from. Always stand tall." For the first time, Ryan actually looked at Trey, not as a target, not as someone to ridicule, but as a person with a story far greater than he could have imagined. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice lower, almost ashamed. Trey took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "You never asked." The room was suffocating in silence. The bullies, who had spent years mocking Trey for being quiet, for being different, now found themselves speechless. Samantha, one of the popular girls who had been laughing along with them earlier, leaned over to get a better look at the files. "So, you're saying your dad was some kind of secret agent?" she asked, her tone no longer mocking but filled with genuine curiosity. Trey didn't answer right away. He let the weight of the moment settle, let them all sit with the realization that they had no idea who they had been tormenting. Then, finally, he nodded. "Something like that." Ryan, still holding the photograph, swallowed hard. We just thought you were some nobody," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Trey exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That's the problem. You judged me before you even knew me." The words hung in the air like an unspoken lesson, one that everyone in the room could feel. The bullies, the bystanders, the students who had laughed along with Ryan, they all felt it. For the first time in his life, Trey wasn't the one feeling small. Ryan hesitated, then, with a deep breath, carefully placed the photo and documents back in the box. Without a word, he handed it back to Trey. I'm sorry," he muttered. Trey took the box, gripping it tightly. He wasn't sure if he could forgive them, but at that moment, it didn't matter. Because for the first time, they were the ones feeling powerless. The weight of Trey's words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the arrogance that had once fueled Ryan and his friends. Their faces, once twisted with smug amusement, were now painted with uncertainty and regret. Ryan swallowed hard, gripping one of the official documents in his trembling hands. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by something Trey had never seen before. Respect. Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Ryan finally managed to ask, his voice quiet, almost afraid. Trey exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "Because people like you don't listen," he said evenly. "You don't ask questions. You just assume. You see someone who looks different, who doesn't fit your idea of what belongs, and you treat them like they're less than you." He shook his head. "My dad didn't fight for this country so I could be bullied in a school cafeteria." Liam's hands fidgeted at his sides, his eyes darting between Trey and the now exposed truth sitting on the table. We didn't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Trey let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. That's the point. You never knew, and you never cared to know. The room had grown deathly quiet. The students who had once smirked and whispered along with Ryan's taunts were now wide-eyed, processing the revelation that the boy they had ignored or ridiculed was the son of a man who had risked his life for something they'd only seen in movies. Even Samantha, who had been one of the loudest to mock Trey, now stared at him with an expression that was hard to read. Guilt? Embarrassment? Maybe both. Trey, she started, but Trey held up a hand, stopping her before she could attempt an empty apology. You all thought I was just some nobody, Trey continued, his voice steady but laced with years of pent-up frustration. You thought I didn't belong because I don't dress like you, because I don't talk like you, because I don't try to impress people who wouldn't respect me anyway. He pointed at the documents. But this proves that I come from something far bigger than any of you could have imagined. Ethan, usually the most vocal of the group, was at a complete loss for words. He looked down at the floor, his usual bravado gone. Ryan, for the first time in his life, seemed to understand what it felt like to be small. Slowly, Trey reached forward and picked up the papers and photograph, carefully placing them back into his metal box. As he snapped the lid shut, the sound echoed across the silent cafeteria, a final punctuation to everything he had just said. Ryan took a deep breath, his face still flushed with embarrassment. Trey, But Trey didn't need to hear it. He had spent years waiting for them to see him for who he really was, and now that they finally did, it wasn't satisfaction he felt, it was exhaustion. With one last glance at the stunned faces around him, Trey turned, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked away. This time, no one dared to laugh. The weight of their actions settled over Ryan, Liam, and Ethan like a suffocating fog. For the first time, they felt something unfamiliar: shame. It clung to them, heavy and relentless, as they watched Trey walk away with a quiet dignity they could never match. Ryan, still gripping the photograph with trembling fingers, felt a lump form in his throat. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow expression. We were just messing around, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Liam exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, but we messed up. Bad. Ethan swallowed, his eyes flickering between his friends and the stunned crowd around them. The students who once laughed alongside them now looked at them with thinly veiled disappointment, as if they had finally seen them for what they really were, cowards who tore others down to feel bigger. Ryan let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair before calling out, "Trey, wait!" Trey paused, but he didn't turn around. His silence was more powerful than anything he could have said. Ryan hesitated, then took a step forward. Look, I get it now, okay? We were wrong, and I treated you like you were nothing, but I was the one who didn't know anything. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the guilt he had tried to bury. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm sorry. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The cafeteria, usually buzzing with noise, felt eerily quiet as every pair of eyes remained fixed on Trey. The tension was thick, as if the very air had frozen in anticipation of his response. Trey turned slowly, his gaze locked onto Ryan's. You're sorry? He asked, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. You're sorry now? Now that you realize who my father was? Now that you see that I'm not just some quiet kid you can push around? Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence stripped away. You don't get to apologize just because you feel guilty now, Trey interrupted, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. What if I wasn't the son of someone important? What if you never found out? Would you still be sorry then? Ryan had no answer. Trey let out a small, bitter chuckle. Yeah, that's what I thought. He turned once more, gripping the strap of his backpack tightly. "I'm not interested in your guilt, Ryan, and I don't need your apology. Just don't ever make the mistake of thinking you can treat me like that again." And with that, Trey walked away, his steps steady and unshaken. Ryan, Liam, and Ethan stood frozen, watching him disappear down the hall, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. This wasn't just about Trey anymore. It was about the kind of people they had chosen to be. And for the first time, they had to face the truth. They weren't the ones in control anymore, and they never would be again. The days after the incident marked a quiet yet undeniable shift in the school's social dynamic. Trey, who had once been an easy target, now walked the halls with his head held high. He no longer avoided eye contact or shrank under the weight of whispers and judgment. Instead, he met people's gazes directly, exuding a quiet strength that no one could ignore. For the first time, students who had never paid him any attention before suddenly saw him in a new light. Some approached him in the hallways, offering small nods of respect. Others murmured words of admiration, acknowledging his composure and intelligence. Even teachers who had often overlooked him now saw him as someone with presence, someone who had endured more than they had ever realized. Ryan and his friends, on the other hand, had become the ones people whispered about. The tables had turned. No longer seen as the dominant figures of the school, they found themselves on the receiving end of judgment. Students avoided them, unwilling to be associated with their cruelty. The laughter that had once followed their every remark was now absent, replaced by awkward silences and the heavy weight of their regret. Trey didn't revel in their downfall. He didn't seek revenge or rub his newfound influence in their faces. Instead, he simply moved forward, channeling his energy into his studies, his future, and his own self-worth. His respect didn't come from intimidation or status. It came from resilience. In one defining moment, he had changed everything. Not just for himself, but for every other student who had ever been made to feel invisible. He wasn't just another kid at Northview High anymore. He was Trey Mitchell, and he wasn't afraid to be seen. Months had passed since that unforgettable day, and now Trey stood on stage at his high school graduation, looking out over a sea of students, teachers, and families. He never imagined he would be standing here, addressing his entire class as their chosen speaker. But life had a way of turning the unexpected into reality. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "It's easy to assume someone's life based on what you see on the outside," he began, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "But the truth is, we all have stories that make us who we are, and no one should ever define your worth by their own prejudices." The audience listened in complete silence, hanging on to every word. Trey scanned the crowd and spotted Ryan, Liam, and Ethan sitting among the graduates. They were no longer the loudest voices in the room. They sat quietly, their expressions unreadable, but Trey didn't speak for them. He spoke for every person who had ever felt unseen, underestimated, or dismissed. "I used to think that keeping my head down was the best way to get through life," he continued. "That if I stayed quiet, if I avoided trouble, I could make it to the other side. But what I've learned is that your voice matters. Your story matters. It doesn't matter where you come from or what secrets you carry. What matters is where you're going and the impact you can make on the world." A ripple of applause began, growing louder until the entire auditorium was filled with cheers. Trey smiled, feeling the weight of his journey settle into something lighter, something powerful. As he stepped away from the podium, he caught sight of his mother in the audience, tears in her eyes, pride radiating from her. He had done it. He had turned his pain into purpose, his silence into strength. The camera zoomed out as Trey walked off the stage, stepping into a future he had fought to claim. The past no longer defined him. His future did. And in that moment, he knew that this was only the beginning.